Welcome to Beyond the B, an ongoing dialogue about the past, present, and future of the B Corp movement. Co-hosts Emmy Allison and Ryan Honeyman facilitate an open and honest conversation about the B Corp movement, advise companies on how to increase their impact, and provide a deep dive into the new B Corp standards that are shaping our community.
I'm Ryan Honeyman, a partner at Lyft Economy. My guest today is Bernard Gouw, who is a social impact specialist and spent the past 4.5 years at B Lab developing the human rights, fair work, and JEDI impact topics. He recently left B Lab and works as an independent consultant so he can work more hands-on with companies. And Bernard, I think you're becoming one of our most frequent return guests now. This is your third return, right? Is this the third one?
This is my and I feel honored. Yeah, it's great to be here again.
Well, it's always great to have you because you literally wrote these topics. And so I think it's helpful for companies to learn from I guess in the US, we say the horse's mouth. Do you say that in Europe? Is that a saying?
I know this expression. You don't look a gift horse. I don't know.
Yeah, expression. I like that. So we'll hear it from the guy who wrote the standards. And so we're going to talk today about JEDI. And so JEDI is one of the 7 main topics in the new standards. And so I'm curious what problem B Lab was trying to solve and what was missing or insufficient in the previous B Corp standards.
So maybe if we can start off with a bit of jargon busting again, Ryan. So JEDI, obviously, justice, equity, diversity, inclusion. I often say this. I don't know how many people get confused anymore, but I've always kind of made a habit of explaining when we talk about JEDI, it is pretty much the same. It's practically the same as what other people might call DEI or IDE. Practically speaking, it's all the same. It's just at some point, B Lab made a decision, let's stick to JEDI.
So just to be clear, there's no additional justice element that maybe DEI is not covering or something?
No, I'll be very honest with you. I think it's mostly about presentation and it's a nice way to package it just to remind us that it's about justice. But practically speaking, I don't personally see any difference. And the topic could have easily been called DEI, and there would have been nothing practically different.
Sure. Great. So what was the sort of intention behind this one and what was maybe missing or insufficient in the previous B Corp standards?
So this was, going back 4 or 5 years, B Lab started putting together topic names and then checking with stakeholders. Are we going in the right direction? And diversity and inclusion was one of the very early ones to be very clear, this is a priority. We need to do more of this. And so that was among stakeholders. And for me as well, I think there's a combination of in the moment that we're in, of course, maybe now in this year, maybe last year, there has been a shift, which we're definitely going to talk about. Going back 3, 4, 5 years, arguably diversity and inclusion work was kind of on an up in a boom phase. And so it was very obvious that had to be part of the standard. Of course, a lot of diversity inclusion content is already was part of version 1.6, the previous standard under the community pillar. So a lot of it was there. And then with the stakeholder consultation, it was very clear, it has to continue being there. But more than that, it has to continue as a mandatory impact topic. We want to see all B Corps working on this because it is really important.
Yeah. So when you were hired at B Lab, just to go back to the sort of genesis of this, you were hired to write the social side of the standards. And they said, here's some ideas maybe, but you do the work to figure out what are those topics. Is that kind of how they laid it out for you?
Yeah, that's pretty much how it went. So when we were hired, and we as Brigitte and myself as the in-house experts, Brigitte led on the environmental and governance topics. There was already some work that had been done. So Sysmita was a big part of that job for those people that know Sysmita. And one of the things that they did is already put out some themes and topics to start testing with stakeholders. What for you is most important? So this is quite a common practice in kind of stakeholder engagement. Stakeholders had to rank what was most important and they could make suggestions for other themes. And so when we were hired and started, we already had that as a starting point, which was really, really useful. It gave a little bit of structure, but absolutely a big part of my job was to test further see what else is missing, look at the horizon, look at regulation, new laws, standards. Is there anything that we're missing that we need to also consider? And a lot of it actually was also around reshaping and reformulating. For the ones who have been really deep in the process will know, looking at the drafts, we had at some point two separate topics. We had workplace culture and fair wages, which ended up merging. So that was a big part of the job as well, is shaping the impact topics to what they ended up being.
Right. Do you remember, this is maybe so far back, but were there other sort of general topic areas that maybe didn't make the cut in those early days?
I think it was actually mostly a case of, I think human rights was an obvious one. I hope listeners either have listened to our episode about human rights or will listen to it, because I think that clearly explains that there was a glaring gap that needed to be addressed. I think we also, all the labor stuff, which is now in Fair Work, was an obvious one to include, and then diversity inclusion as well. The main task actually was just seeing how to cut things, how to present things. I think one of the confusing things was arguably human rights, JEDI, and Fair Work could all have been one topic. I've said this quite a few times before. So a lot of the job was actually understanding, where are people currently at? How do these things tend to work within companies? And basically, how should we divide it so that A, it's as clear as possible, but also there's as much impact as possible? And then we ended up deciding, okay, dividing it into these three topics was the best way to go. And there's like a side note, which is, of course, what was the right title for this topic? And we did toy around with a few different ones. JEDI is primarily used in the US. And actually, one of the reasons that we did end up with JEDI is because B-Lab had used that historically. I don't know exactly why B-Lab chose JEDI. What I do know is, of course, B-Lab has very strong US roots. There's also Alonda Williams, who led on a lot of that work, has a US background. So I think that's why JEDI was chosen. And we decided, let's just keep things simple. We're using JEDI. We'll continue using JEDI, even though JEDI is not really used outside of the US that much, from my research and from feedback.
It's interesting, just before we get into the actual nuts and bolts of the standards, in 2019, when Dr. Tiffany Jana and I wrote the second edition of the B Corp Handbook, we really encouraged B-Lab to go into DEI more explicitly. And I felt like that was answered during COVID and the racial justice uprisings between 2020 to arguably 2022 or so. And at the same time, as you know, because of the anti-ESG, anti-DEI sentiment in the US, I'm curious if you think that if the consultations started today, if JEDI would sort of, quote unquote, make it through as a main topic, or like, how do you see that sort of evolution and B-Lab's commitment to making this a key topic?
Yeah, it's a question I've received more often is, to put it a different way, basically like looking at what happened in the US, for example, did B-Lab feel the need, or did B-Lab actually change what was in the draft JEDI standards? The amazing thing about working in the standards team for B-Lab is there's all the resources that the team needed and the freedom. And actually, in terms of influencing, there's very little undue pressure put on the team. I think what did happen was a very serious look at, okay, if we look at the US, for example, there are these executive orders, the president and the cabinet saying these things are no longer allowed. What does that mean for the standard? Can B Corp still fairly meet the standard? Is there really a blocker? How much of it is a perceived blocker versus an actual legal blocker? So we did really look into that a lot. And not just for the US, but we did this exercise for countries all around, because I think it's fair to say, whilst it was very pronounced and recent in the US, this anti-DEI movement, there is anti-DEI sentiment all over the world. There's very exclusive and harmful legislation happening all over, and it has been happening for decades, right? So we've been very mindful of the fact that this work is very difficult to do culturally, but also sometimes legally. And so we really went through diligently to try to understand what are the perceived blockers and what are the actual blockers, and can companies still fairly meet our standards, yes or no? That was more so the focus point than thinking, oof, how is this going to perceive? Are we ruffling feathers that we shouldn't ruffle? those were really not conversations that we in the standards team had, because our goal was very clear. It's like, let's make standards that are responsive to our community and to the issues that we're seeing. We want to be as impactful and as clear as possible. And so therefore, the so-called anti-ESG movement, anti-DEI movement, honestly, it's a real privilege to be in, but actually didn't impact us very much or at all.
That's great. And thanks for the sort of inside info there on B Lab's journey. Well, if we dive into some of the JEDI standards, I believe the first requirement for companies is around data collection and gathering sort of feedback, and maybe even before choosing actions. I'm curious why that sequence, and maybe even let's take a step back. Like, how did you even approach, okay, JEDI is on board, we're going to do it. Then what? How do you choose the topics to even offer companies?
I mean, I think one thing that's very well established within the DEI space is this idea of needing data and evidence to base your decisions on. And to clarify, when I say data, I actually mean information, because I think with data, people often immediately go towards numbers. And numbers is a big part of this, but more important than numbers is just information on people's experience. And that can be numbers, can also be what, so-called qualitative information. Understanding people's perspectives and experiences. A big part of that is because we all have our biases, inherent biases. If you have one person doing this work, not getting information, then they're not going to do very good work, because they're going to be limited. And so this work requires insightfulness, and actually like almost all of the B Corp work requires active stakeholder engagement to get different views. So that is the starting point for all good JEDI or DEI work, is just getting that information, getting that insight, and on the basis of that, making certain steps. And on the side of making steps, what was really difficult was with the new standards, we want universality, we want consistency, but very quickly ran into this issue of, okay, standards for all sizes, pretty much all sectors, pretty much all countries. Is it even feasible to have these minimum DEI actions? And the conclusion quickly was actually no, because it's so contextual, right? What applies to one country really does not apply to another country. And even within a country, what applies to one company doesn't apply to another company, because it really is essentially about people, and people's priorities change on their very unique context. So I think there are examples of some actions that potentially could be made universal. So an example would be making sure that your website is accessible to everyone. This is currently an option in the standards, could in theory be made universal, but we then get into the domain of, is it a priority for every single B Corp? Well, arguably no. A company with a web shop, where there's a lot of traffic, there's a lot of communication through the website, yes, arguably it's a priority for them. But what if there is a small company, maybe providing services, a lot of it is word of mouth, they don't really rely on the website. Maybe it's like a social media page and not an actual dedicated domain website. It's less of a priority. So to kind of tie it all together, it's really hard to prescribe and mandate universal requirements around JEDI. And then if we look at what are the pieces that we definitely can mandate, like the common denominator, well, one is gathering that information, because that's relevant for all companies. And then the second part is, even if we can't say which actions, we can definitely say, okay, you have to do some actions. And that's how we got to the framework of JEDI 1 and JEDI 2. In the standard JEDI 1, collect data, JEDI 2, the actions.
Great. So what is the actual requirement for JEDI 1, just to be clear for folks?
JEDI 1 is all about collecting information and gathering that insight. And there's a differentiated approach depending on size. Now, focusing on larger companies, the emphasis is put on collecting and disaggregating information by gender identity, or sex at birth. And I think the easiest way to think about this for companies is they're likely already collecting some human resources metrics, or as we call it in the standards, people-related measurements. An easy example would be your retention or attrition rate. Basically, we want to see those kinds of numbers disaggregated so that very simply a company can say, this is the number for men, this is the number for women. And disaggregation is really, really key in this space because it basically allows us to see differences between groups. If we have aggregation, we're basically hiding the truth. And I think an obvious example of this is what's actually in the fair work, but I think this is an easy example that people can relate to is the gender wage gap. We see the news stories, we see headlines that women receive X cents for $1 that men make. The only reason we can say that is because we have disaggregated data on wages. So that's a super clear example of if we didn't have that disaggregated data, we wouldn't be able to say those things. So it's all about making clear and getting insight to then know how to take action, right? So in the case of wages, if there is a wage gap, right, let's do something about that. Let's try to figure out what are the root causes. If we look at attrition, for example, it could be worth a company, measuring attrition, then disaggregating by gender, understanding when is that attrition happening. A very easy example is that sometimes there's attrition around the time of women having babies, going on maternity leave, struggling with reintegration, and then leaving the workforce. Again, if there is one attrition or retention rate for men and women aggregated, then essentially women's unique experiences are hidden. By disaggregating, companies can get clarity on whether there is a unique experience, yes or no.
Yeah. I love the importance of that. And I think the challenge for B Corps, we've even experienced it at Lyft Economy where we have a small team and we might do a survey and notice there's differences. And then sometimes the skill set of the company to figure out, okay, well, what do we do about that? That's a whole nother component of this. So how are you, let's say a company does this first component of JEDI, they disaggregate the data and they're like, oh, wow, across these 5 questions, like employee happiness, we notice that women's happiness is lower. We notice that there's more attrition. We notice that there's other things. And then they're like kind of paralyzed, like, well, what do we do about that? What kind of resources or thoughts have you put into them? How to help companies address those things?
I think the important thing to realize here is this data essentially serves as signals that something might be wrong. It doesn't necessarily mean that something is wrong, but it's certainly a signal that there's something underlying that needs to be looked into. So let's take the example, I think recruitment is a good example where, okay, let's look at who is holding entry-level jobs. Or actually, better than that, let's look at all the new hires in the past year. We're seeing that we're hiring more of one group than another group. Doesn't mean that necessarily something has gone wrong, but it's a signal. So let's look into it. And what a company can do is look at the so-called recruitment pipeline. So, okay, let's try to see if we can get data on all those applying, all those getting to a first interview, second interview, getting an offer. And then companies kind of track the numbers and compare to see where might something be going wrong. Because maybe, for example, at the hiring stage, or rather at the first stage of recruitment, the application stage, there's a 50-50 split between men and women. But somewhere between there and actual contract offer, one group seems to be outweighing the other. That suggests there's something in the recruitment practice that is favoring one group over another. So a lot of it is like being an investigator, a bit of a detective, looking into the data. And again, linking back to what I said before, we're talking a lot about numbers here. That's one side of it. Another side of it is just speaking to people. So if I were to see skewed numbers, I would then maybe go to my new starters and say, hey, I'm seeing these odd numbers. And maybe speaking to one group, you could do like a focus group or just a mini survey and saying, look, we have this data. We're trying to understand what's happening. Tell us about your experience and tell us how you experience this and whether you think maybe you have an explanation of why this is happening. And maybe someone will say, yes, I felt I was unfairly treated during the recruitment for XYZ reasons. So I think that's how companies can go about this. Again, reemphasizing that it's purely about information, and depending on the maturity level and experience level, companies can make it as simple or as complex as they want. On the more complex side, they can run statistical analysis and make sure that there is statistical significance, blah, blah, blah. It's important to note none of that is actually mandated in the standard for good reason, because it's really hard to do. In-house, usually that skill set is missing. To hire someone costs money. So that's why we don't require it explicitly in the standards. So that's on the complex side. On the easier side, a lot of it is just speaking to people, right? And trying to get inputs. And I think particularly for smaller companies, we do in the standards put emphasis on either running like a mini survey or some kind of group discussion to get those inputs from people. Because who better than to share experiences about their lives than the people themselves? And oftentimes having some kind of group discussion is just the most direct and easiest way to get information. I will add, I think, whenever I talk about group discussion, a lot of particularly like DEI practitioners will be like, whoa, but sometimes the space isn't safe enough. So I will add that caveat that jumping into a group discussion, suddenly asking about, hey, do you feel excluded at work? Of course, is not for all context. People need to be mindful about what makes sense for the context. Do people feel safe to share? And companies can, of course, try to create that safe space intentionally. So maybe having a discussion only with one group. So if we're talking about recruitment and potential difference between men and women, maybe having one group with women having a discussion and a separate discussion with men.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I do think it's important to, like you said, know the signals and disaggregate the data. And then the way that you look into those things and talk to folks can be fraught, right? Like you said, like if you're the white male boss and you have 3 Black women who are employees and you're like, hey, tell me about your experience and like why the satisfaction scores, like that might not necessarily be the best way to approach it, right? So I think B Lab has some good resources around equity conversations. At Lift Economy, one woman on our team, Phoenix Soleil, does a lot of this work. But I would just caution folks to be curious and do some research and thinking, read some resources, talk to some experts before sort of like launching into off the cuff discussion with your employees about their experiences. So I'm glad that you mentioned that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a good example here of stakeholders asking for something in the standard that didn't end up being put in, particularly from the JEDI DEI space, stakeholders saying any kind of discussion has to be done by a trained external expert. And whilst I think that's the ideal, the challenge, of course, is a lot of companies, particularly some smaller companies, don't have that money. And in some cases, that expert might not be there. There's some countries in the world where that expertise, those consultancies don't really exist, right? So mandating something like that can actually cause more problems than solve. So unfortunately, that's not something that's in there, but I think we did end up putting it as a recommendation that in the ideal scenario, companies do hire an expert or have an in-house expert that leads those kinds of discussions.
Yeah. I think it's also worth mentioning that in my experience and working in this sort of racial justice space, there's also this emergent component of, there is legacy trauma from just the way capitalism works, racism, patriarchy, all these systems, imperialism, colonialism. So folks will come in to the workspace with those different traumas and legacies. And I think an emerging space for a lot of companies is what is the company's responsibility and like what is possible to heal in terms of that trauma. I know in the sort of racial justice uprising time, there was a lot of let's bring everything, like all parts of ourselves into the work and like process it and really bring it into the space. And a lot of companies struggled because they weren't equipped to deal with that level of sharing and sort of the challenges of it. And so some companies, I remember 21 Signals, like the Basecamp people were like, we're not talking about politics anymore. And like, we're not talking about anything anymore in the company. We're just going to keep that at home. So I think there's the extreme of no boundaries. Everything is on the table. It's almost like therapy at work and like working through everything, healing all historical trauma. And then there's the like, we're not talking about anything, shut it down. And so I think in the B Corp space, we're all generally, I feel like, caring people who want to make space for everyone to show up with their whole selves. And how do we, and that, you don't have the answer, but this is more like a rhetorical question. It's like, how do we find the right balance of providing the support and care that's needed in the workplace and also what is actually possible to heal in a workplace and what is someone's own work and like through personal therapy or other things. And so that's just a messy part of all this. I'm not sure if you have any take on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, this is a clear difference between the human rights work, where the human rights work, there is international agreement, there's a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's on paper, human rights is kind of globally agreed. And all of that, like what good looks like on human rights is established and clear. And then a lot of the JEDI DEI stuff really is not. It's exactly what you're saying. And I think that's interesting because on one hand, it's where there's a little bit more kind of challenging, there's more innovation, new ways of thinking, anti-colonial thinking, for example, that happens in this space. But what is also the case is because, the world is large, we have many, many different kinds of cultures, then what good looks like when it comes to this work really, really differs as well. And then trying to convert that to requirements and the standards is so difficult. It really is the case that every context, cultural context, company context is so unique. And, there is a danger. What you're describing is basically the spectrum, right? Companies will always be somewhere on the spectrum. There is a danger if you push companies too far, too fast, that there is a backlash, that things go wrong, that people don't feel safe, that the company does things the wrong way. And so that's why the standards are actually quite flexible here. And not just JEDI 2, where there's a choice of what actions to pick, but also, for example, when we look at the disaggregation of data, for really, really large companies, they actually get to choose the second social identity that they disaggregate on. So we spoke about segregating data based on gender identity or sex at birth, because generally speaking, that kind of discrimination is global. But then when we talk about what are other forms in which people are being discriminated against, that's so specific to a country, a cultural context, or even a company context. And that's why we give companies the choice of what to focus on. So an example would be if a company has complaints from people with disabilities, then it would make sense for them to have that as a focus point, as opposed to us mandating and saying, well, in your country, racial discrimination tends to be an issue, therefore you must do that. And so that's how we're trying to meet companies where they are while still trying to push them to do more than they might otherwise be doing.
Yeah. You mentioned the second sort of main topic area and that flexibility. So let's talk about this sort of menu of actions. And, we don't have to go into all, I think there's 26 or something. Does that sound right?
There were 26 and it was cut down to 19.
Okay, 19. But there are some broad buckets. So tell us about your process on the writing the standard side of, okay, we know we're going to have this first one where we're asking folks to measure and disaggregate data. And then how did you come to this other sort of approach of like the menu and the 19 actions and flexibility?
I mean, a lot of it started with trying to figure out what is best practice when it comes to this work, putting it on a piece of paper. Then, as we mentioned before, trying to find those minimums that we could require of all companies, quickly realizing we couldn't, then thinking, okay, I now have early days, maybe 30, 35 of these actions, good stuff that a company should do. And then thinking, okay, how can we still require companies to do something, but give them the flexibility? And that's how we came up with this menu. It's like, okay, like you're in a restaurant, you have a choice of what to eat, but we are telling you have to order something from the menu. And like a menu, it's divided into different buckets to make it kind of navigable. What we're also trying to do with the menu of options is actually inspire companies. One of the biggest pitfalls I see with this kind of work is companies misunderstanding and thinking DEI work is only about my employees. No, it's way more than that. It's also about your customers. It's about your wider community. It's also about your supply chain. And then B, to address this pitfall of, okay, I'm just going to do training. As long as I kind of educate and make people aware, things will magically get better, which is not only naive, but has been scientifically proven to in most cases not work. What the data and the scientific evidence shows is that general staff training on diversity inclusion generally does not work. And that's actually why it's not one of the options in the menu. We do have other kinds of actions related to, for example, building capacity of training of senior leaders, because that's different, but general staff training, that's why that's not included.
How did you divide these into the categories of foundation within the workplace and beyond the workplace? What was the logic behind those three categories?
So we had all these potential actions that we could include. And the benefit of dividing it is it gives companies kind of guidance on how to think about them, hopefully also inspires them and shows them that the JEDI actions is way more than only focusing on your own workforce. So the first set is what we call foundations, meaning any company can do it. And as the name suggests, it's about laying the foundations for some of the other actions. Then the second set is called within the workplace, and this focuses on employees, whatever happens within as the name suggests, within the workplace, within the office. And then the third one is called beyond the workplace, and that's to very clearly signal that good JEDI work is about what happens beyond the workplace, meaning consumers, the community, as well as potentially the supply chain. So that's why we divide it into those buckets. We're hoping that it'll very clearly show the breadth of what can be done so that companies don't have that pitfall of, I'm just going to do general staff training, or as long as I do X, everything will be fine. So what we're trying to say with these three buckets is we expect companies to work across all of them. That's also built into the requirements, to work across the three different sets, because that is how you change a system. And that's how a company can learn and can improve over time. Because we do expect, for example, improving internal practices to affect the ability of a company to improve its external practices, and maybe even vice versa. So that's why we have these three sets. And we have 19 actions at the moment. It would be great if we can expand that over time, kind of have this menu that kind of grows. And as there's more best practice that's proven in the wider DEI space, we kind of bring that into the menu to continue guiding companies to show them what's possible.
I appreciate the flexibility because, for example, I'm working with a large client, and out of the 19 actions, I think they're even extra large actually, and they have to do 2 by year 0. And I think they already have 2 that are kind of almost done that they're already doing, which is nice. And by year 3, I think they have to have 6 actions, right? So it's not just, I appreciate that that it ladders up. How do you think about the flexibility cutting both ways? Like, it's good for companies, but also it may be sort of like a race to the least disruptive ones. How did you think about doing that? And so companies weren't avoiding some things by doing the easiest ones.
Yeah, it's a question I've received more often. The truth is, I think whilst one reader might look at it and be like, well, these are clearly the easiest ones, the truth is, I actually think it's really specific to a company and even cultural context. So to give you an example, I think in the US, probably a company might look at making a public commitment to JEDI as like, that's either pretty easy or I've already done it. But if we go to maybe a place like Japan, making a public commitment on JEDI suddenly feels, something so public, that's going to be a challenge for my company. And so I think it is contextual what's easy and what's difficult. Similarly, where companies are doing things and are not already doing things. What we also tried to do is we did try to adjust each of the actions so that they're roughly in line with one another. So if one, based on feedback, if one was very clearly more difficult than all the other ones, then maybe we would scale it back a little bit. Or conversely, if one, we got a lot of feedback from different cultural regions or geographical regions and different cultures saying this definitely is too easy, then we would increase the expectation. So my hope, let's be honest, it has been tested in consultation, but not really tested in actual audits. A lot of this is new content, so it is a bit of an experimentation. So we're going to have to, B Lab is going to have to reflect on the results, look at incoming audit data. Which actions are they gravitating? If all B Corps around the world are all going for the same ones, a lot of companies are avoiding certain ones. And I think that would be an argument to say, okay, there has to be a bit of calibration to make sure that there is that evenness across the actions.
Maybe it would even help just to give folks a sense if we dive into one in particular and just sort of walk through what might be required. So one that I think could be relevant to a lot of companies is the company reviews and updates existing policies using JEDI principles. And what I've noticed with clients too is sometimes the top level requirement. Like one of them is, I think, provide more leave than what's the legal minimums. They're like, oh yeah, we do that. But then in the subtext of the compliance criteria, it's actually quite specific about what that would qualify. And so for this one, it's like reviewing the policies and principles. The compliance criteria is review at least 5 policies that affect people using A, data from JEDI 1. So that would be the stakeholder data that you gathered. B, is stakeholder feedback. C, it's JEDI commitment statement, if applicable. And D, it's improved in-house knowledge or capacity, if applicable, using JEDI 2.B. And so you're supposed to look at things like terminology used in the policies, impacts the policies have had on people, relationships to JEDI principles, and then following this review, update the policies if needed. Can you speak about that one? For example, like how did that one come about? And have you had any experience with companies that have done that or anything that might be helpful for folks who are maybe thinking about that one?
Yeah, and this was one of the earlier ones to be put in because this is often a good starting point for a lot of this kind of work, because companies with employees will have some policies in place, and a lot of those policies will relate to those people, working conditions, an overtime policy, the wage policy, hiring policy. And so that's an easy starting point, which is like, rather than thinking about new stuff, what else could we do? Let's look at what we've already done and look at it with a critical lens to see whether they can be improved, particularly those that are less experienced with a lot of this work. They should kind of take a step back, see what they've learned. And that's where the compliance criteria you just mentioned, it alludes to some of the other topics or the other actions that there are and sub-requirements. So what have we learned from doing those other things that we can now go back and look at these policies that we already have? And indeed, it's looking at things like terminology. Are there some very basic things that maybe we kind of assumed, maybe one person wrote it without much feedback and it was just from their perspective? Is there certain maybe outdated terminology? Or maybe there was a policy made in one country and the company expanded to other countries and no one really took the time to review the language from the lens of those other countries and those other languages. So it's generally good practice to review policies, but what we're saying is review it really from this lens of, are people potentially being excluded with the language? Is the language appropriate? And the language is one side. There's a whole other side, which is kind of technically in the experiences of people, are people maybe being excluded? So to give you an example, if we look at menstruation leave, there was a lot of debate around this in Spain recently because the Spanish government introduced menstruation leave. And I found it fascinating listening to this debate because one might think, okay, menstruation leave is great because it provides leave to women when they're menstruating. And it's obviously optional. If they feel like they need it, if they feel like they can't work, then it's there as an entitlement. So maybe in the sick leave policy, a company might say, okay, let's add it because it gives women certain entitlements and protections. But there are a lot of signals to suggest a separate leave category for menstruation leave actually doesn't necessarily support women. It can actually be stigmatizing because it actually puts down on paper, okay, this person is regularly taking 2 days a month for menstruation leave specifically. There's another side to it, which is even if it's not stigmatizing, maybe there's a perception of stigmatization and people not feeling comfortable to leave it. And actually, if we look at a lot of Asian countries, Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, they already have national legislation on menstruation leave, but it's not really used for these reasons that I just mentioned. And so when looking at the debate in Spain, what I found really interesting is understanding both sides and then translating that to kind of the B Corp and a company world. I think what's key is review the policies. Don't assume that there's always one approach that it's better. In this case of menstruation leave, there really are two sides to this. And actually, at the end of the day, the right approach is whatever the people who are affected in that context think is the right approach. So if a company is looking at their sick leave policy and is thinking about menstruation leave, speak to the women within your workforce, ask them, how do you feel about this? What terms should we use? Would you actually use this leave if we were to introduce it? Yes or no? And then make changes accordingly. So I think that's the best example I can give of something that's very, very topical that I think highlights how reviewing is very important. Reviewing based on stakeholder input is very important. And B, that there isn't necessarily a universal outcome that's always good across every company, that it really is specific to the context.
Yeah, one other example that I think a client of mine, this extra large client, was like, oh, we have mentoring, or I believe one of them is around mentoring or sort of affinity groups. Does that ring a bell? And the company supports at least 2 employee resource or affinity groups, which sounds great. And the company did have them. But then again, the groups are worker led. So they have to be empowered to decide how often to meet, whether or not to take notes. They're with a particular social identity. So it can't be like, hey, our employee affinity group is those who like the National Basketball Association, right? Like,
exactly.
And so I think there's nuance that I think the top level. So I guess I'm sort of encouraging companies to look a little closer on each of the sub requirements, because they may meet partially some of it, but there's probably some improvements that companies will have to do.
Yeah. And, there's a bit of a hack, let's say a certification hack, if you will, here, which is I think sometimes companies struggle with direction, right? There's a lot in the standards. Maybe they don't have a clear idea of where to start or what to pick or what good looks like. Now, one of the things that is consistent in the standards is stakeholder engagement. And this is where the hack comes in, is if management doesn't know where to go, ask people. So in this case of the affinity groups, ask workers. So do you want an affinity group? Okay, this is what an affinity group, does that interest you? If we were to set them up, what would the groups be that interest you? And actually that makes a lot of this work way easier because it's targeted, it's going to be relevant, and of course, bonus, it means meeting all those sub-criteria in the standards, which require the company to engage with stakeholders. So that's my big tip. I think sometimes maybe companies are a little bit afraid, like, oh, but if I ask, I'll open Pandora's box and maybe there's really high expectations. And I think that can be true, but of course, all of it is in how things are communicated and explaining why are you asking these questions and what's within your remit, what's not within your remit. I think clear communication and talking to the right people at the right time is really a recipe for success for any company.
Are there 1, 2, or 3 that you might suggest companies who are feeling overwhelmed by 19? Like, hey, I know you're overwhelmed. These 2 to 3 are probably good places to start. Does anything like that come to mind for you?
I think if a company is very new to all of this, and wants to put some money down, I think the equity audit in the foundation set is a great way to start, because what essentially they'd be doing is bringing in an external party and doing an assessment. And that assessment basically gives a framework, because they would review documents, they would speak to workers, and that's actually a very clear way to make tangible gains. Maybe to make it a little bit more concrete for listeners, because maybe equity audit is not a term they're familiar with, because I'll be honest, it's also not a term I've come across very often, is basically any kind of audit that looks at fairness or equity. In my career, when I was working for the United Nations, I did a gender audit. So I basically went to a UNICEF office, and we basically reviewed, it was a gender audit. So we looked at what are the different experiences between men and women, looking at documents and interviewing people. And like all audits, it's about looking at gaps and then coming up with recommendations. So that's like a tangible idea of what a company could do. Thinking of some other examples, I think companies who have a workforce and they're an engaged workforce, I definitely look at the within the workplace set. And then there's the one that we just spoke about, which is reviewing policies. I think that's a great one to start because, again, the company doesn't have to create anything new. They just have to work with what they have, speak to people, get feedback, and then make updates. And I think, speaking honestly, I do think the criteria, they're pretty flexible, right? Because they say pick 5, any 5 you want, as long as it's relevant to people. And you only have to update them if there is a reason to update them. So that does give companies quite a lot of flexibility. The last one, which I'll add, is this is one of the actions that I think is one of the coolest. In fact, there's 2 that are quite related, is the inclusive language guide. And there's one for internal communications and there's one for external communications. I think that's a great starting point because particularly nowadays, most companies do a lot of marketing and do a lot of internal communications, right? Particularly digital communications. We're really in this space where there's just a lot of communication a lot of the time. And doing that exercise is a great way of assessing, okay, how are we communicating now? I think crucially, there's a lot of really good implementation resources there. And the criteria allows for, rather than creating a new document, allows for adopting of an external document. So one of my favorite resources there is one from Oxfam, an inclusive language guide. A company could, in theory, say, we're adopting this full guide from Oxfam in its entirety. And so that's, I think, a very easy way to make quick, tangible steps that hopefully people will also feel very quickly, right? Particularly those working in communications, they see the guide and they have clarity on terms that they should use and terms that they shouldn't use.
Got it. That's a good tip about the Oxfam Inclusive Language Guide. I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, it's a really good one.
One other quick one on the company's website meets accessibility standards. There's a lot of these, I feel like a lot of major websites have them. It's like a little button at the bottom that's like this little blue button that's sort of like if you have a disability or something, you can like press the button to like change the whole website to be more accessible. Do you know off the top of your head, is that an acceptable way of like meeting this standard?
I mean, certainly that would be part of it. So what's really cool about this space is there is global consensus on what good looks like, and it's the so-called WCAG standards, WCAG. It's a really cool initiative. They have resources in so many different languages, and they do really good and clear work to define these are those steps companies or website designers should take to make a website accessible. You know, you just spoke about an example. Another one is if you have a video, add a caption to explain what's in the video. So it's really clear and defined what a company needs to do in this space. So I think also for companies that are maybe a bit lost, this could also be a good one to start with, because particularly if a company already has in-house web designers or user experience people, actually most user experience people and web designers will already be familiar with WCAG standards. So they can just go to it, look at the right criteria, make sure that they're implemented. So it is potentially a pretty straightforward one to meet. The only thing that I'll add is, which might be new for a lot of companies, is they have to do some kind of testing with a group with disabilities, right? So this ties in with something that we've said a million times on these episodes is stakeholder engagement is key. So it is important that a company doesn't just do what they think is right in isolation or just follow what it's written on a piece of paper. There has to be some degree of live testing with, for example, a person who is blind or doesn't see well. So that is an important part of this process to be compliant with the standards.
I noticed a couple times in the JEDI and maybe other places, it says it can be carried out by an internal or external specialist. What do you think? Because I think people might, well, I'm not an accessibility web specialist, you know, but I might review the guidelines. Does that qualify as a specialist? I don't know. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, this is one of those really difficult ones where someone who works in that space will say it has to be a specialist because this is super important to them. Now, whilst also important to us, if we have loads of requirements that require external specialists, the costs just go up. And arguably, a lot of companies may already have an internal specialist, so it would be weird to force them to work with an external specialist. So what we try to do is be very deliberate on when do we need to define that specialism. So to go back to the equity audit that we spoke about, there we do specify working with an external specialist, and then we have very specific criteria on what does it mean for a company to have that specialism. And so that's because we find it for the equity audit, that is an example where it is super crucial that that specialism is there. But there are other examples where it's less important. And so maybe it's a requirement, but not strictly required. So I think a common tip that you are often giving people, I'm often giving people, is really read the detail, because that's where it'll be defined. And actually a lot of the flexibility as well, which companies can benefit from, that's often in the clarifying the compliance criteria section.
You also just talk about this, we talked about the anti-woke, anti-DEI, anti-ESG sort of movement, and obviously in the United States, and I do know in other places as well. And the standards talk about allowing companies to use other terms instead of JEDI, like fairness, access, belonging, equality, or how did you think through that? And I don't know, I guess one part of me is like, yes, we should do the work and the name is less important. And there's another part of me that's like standing up for what we believe in the B Corp community and don't change the language. I don't know. How did you bridge that sort of conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what you're saying is you don't want companies to abuse the flexibility to basically do kind of green hushing, right? It's like hide away a lot of the good work that they're doing. The challenge is even if we put anti-ESG and anti-DEI movement to one side, arguably you can never have all companies use the same words, right? Just simply if we look at language. A company in Latin America, in a Spanish-speaking part of Latin America, they will be using Spanish terms. So already they're not going to be using JEDI, maybe they'll be using other terms. So that already is a good example of how mandating one set of terms was never going to work to begin with because of different languages. Then the other side of it is this space is open and dynamic and companies do tend to use different terms. So JEDI relates to 4 terms, but belonging is often used as well in this space. And belonging is just as valid as those other 4 terms, right? So that's another reason why we can't mandate which terms are being used. And then we get to the fact that there is this anti-DEI, anti-GS movement, ESG movement. That's just yet another reason to offer this flexibility. Also, in a lot of places, even before this anti-DEI movement that occurs in some places, there is and has for a long time been an anti-DEI government where arguably using certain terms can put people at risk. The employees can put them at risk of being targeted by the government. So, if we use an example, in Ghana, same-sex marriage is illegal. So if suddenly there was all this information about LGBTQIA plus rights, that's a danger for the company and the employee. So that's why we don't, it just, for so many different reasons, it doesn't make sense to force companies to use specific terms. And we do want to be flexible. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe the last question or two here. What were the hardest debates or compromises in developing the topic? And were there some stakeholders who wanted B Lab to require some things that didn't make it into the final standards? Or like, how did you feel about where you ended up with versus some of the feedback and things that folks wanted?
I'll give you 2 examples, one reflecting feedback from the US and the UK, and then another feedback representing mainland Europe feedback. So particularly from the US and the UK, there was a lot of feedback saying, we think all B Corps should do something on racial justice. All right, so if we look at the standards, all B Corps or most B Corps have to do something on gender equality because that's a global problem. Now, what a lot of stakeholders will say is racism is also a global problem. The thing is, that is sort of true and it's sort of not true. So it is true in the sense that we have, if we make a generalization about the world, the global north and the global south, there's a form of racism, right? If we look at, what you mentioned before, the history of colonialism and imperialism, rooted in a lot of how business works nowadays, right? With, to again generalize, there's the retailers in the global north with their supply chains in the global south. And there is a lot of exploitation built into those supply chains and built into what capitalism looks like today. So that is a form of racism. But that is actually addressed through a lot of the human rights work and doesn't necessarily need to be called out as racial justice work, right? So if we look at human rights, there's an entire subsection on improving conditions in the supply chain. So that was one thing we had to very clearly communicate to these stakeholders. Okay, it's not that we don't think racial justice globally, we agree that it's important, but we can tackle it without necessarily using those terms. Now, in a separate context, racial justice within a country is also important. So in the UK and the US, for example, stakeholders were telling me, right, in my context, this is the most important thing happening right now. This is following maybe a year or two after Black Lives Matter. We have to stand for this. If we don't have this in the standard, we're going to have a lot of stakeholders to answer for, and we're going to have companies that are going to be upset. Also, a lot of companies are doing a lot of good work in the racial justice space. If they don't see that reflected in the standard, they're going to be upset. Now, this was really challenging because it really forced us to think, okay, it is indeed important. The feedback was coming from the US and the UK, but racial injustice is a problem in many countries around the world. But is it a problem in every single country in the world? Arguably, no. Moreover, if we look at company's specific context, is racial justice the single most important thing? No. And that was a reason for us to not put it in the standard and not mandate it of all companies. So to give a clear example, maybe for a company in their country, let's take India as an example, the caste system and dismantling the caste system makes more sense to focus on than racial injustice or racial inequity. But then even if we look at a company context, maybe there has been lots of problems with senior leadership and anti-trans sentiments. Rather than us saying you have to focus on racial equity, you focus on what makes sense for your context, speak to your stakeholders, speak to your employees. Maybe because there are lots of complaints about anti-trans sentiments, then that's what they focus on. So there's an element of making sure companies focus on the areas that matter most, or to use the technical terms, it's about materiality, relevance and being salient to the issues in their context. So that's why racial equity isn't called out in any requirement specifically. The second example, so particularly from European countries like the Netherlands, Germany, France, we got a lot of feedback along the lines of, don't make me do this JEDI work. I don't want to be labeling people. I feel deeply uncomfortable by this, and it's illegal in my country. A lot of this fear is rooted in the Second World War and the persecution of Jewish people, right? Where there was literally a labeling of people, which led to a genocide. And they're really deeply embedded is this feeling of, I don't want to label minorities. I don't want to label groups of people because that leads to bad things. That is also partly why there is legislation in some European countries, for example, banning the collection of data on race. The thing is, this has actually been blown way out of proportion. So there's two sides to this. One is companies misunderstand or overthink how much is illegal. So we literally got feedback. And by the way, this is one of the most prevalent pieces of feedback we got on JEDI. So we're talking about dozens of companies saying this is, I am not allowed to collect any demographic data on my employees. But that is simply not true. So it's a misunderstanding of the law. And I think related to that, the second point is it's about this deep cultural discomfort with labeling people, where companies might even say, okay, even if I'm allowed to, I just really don't want to. Now, what's interesting is, to be very honest with you and the listeners, usually when a stakeholder says, I feel very uncomfortable collecting this data, it tends to be a person from a majority group. So in focus groups, it tends to be white and male stakeholders that communicate this to me, which I think is an interesting observation. And it leads to this whole other side of, it is, again, as I mentioned before, it's a misunderstanding about the legal barriers. But then there's still this question of, okay, even if it is allowed, is it worth pushing for, right? Because those cultural discomfort, that really is deep. Is it worth pushing companies and pushing them into this space of discomfort? And the answer is actually yes. It wasn't an easy yes. We had to test a lot. We had to educate a lot to see what really is the discomfort, where is it coming from? And we had to really check ourselves, like, do we actually really believe in this idea of gathering data on your workforce, demographic data? Is it really that necessary that we are going to really mandate it even for these countries where there is this deep discomfort? And so we push through, we really stand behind it. We think it's important. And we spoke a little bit in the beginning of why it's important, but a lot of it is about getting that visibility and understanding the different experiences between different groups. There is no other way than getting that information.
That's a very helpful example. I'm really glad you brought that up. And I understand the sort of legacy concerns, especially in Europe, around labeling. And I'm glad that you're also pushing us to be uncomfortable with moving into the space. So thank you.
Yeah. It's an important part of any kind of JEDI, DEI work, isn't it?
Yeah. Maybe wrapping up, anything we missed that we didn't touch on, and then where can folks find you if they have more questions or want to work with you going forward?
The last note, a lot of what we talked about was quite kind of technical, and I think the note I want to leave on is that I hope readers will actually be quite excited by the JEDI requirements. And actually, what I'll add a little side note, which is, whilst we spoke a lot about the controversies and the pushback, actually, if I reflect on which topics have I received the most positive feedback on, it is JEDI as well, which is interesting, right? So the most questions, maybe the most pushback, but also the most positive feedback. And I like that because it's meant to be there to push boundaries, inspire companies, also give, particularly those people working within a company that are maybe kind of going against the corporate grain in their company, give them something to hold on to say, look, B Corp thinks or B Lab thinks this is important. Let's do it because it's on the paper. And then obviously once they start their journey, they can learn and see, okay, this is actually impactful work. And they do it maybe for different reasons. But hopefully the way that JEDI topic is written, and particularly the menu of options, inspires companies and gets them excited to do this work whilst still being very tangible about this is what good looks like and pick what makes sense for your context. So I hope that that's the experience that companies will have. And then to answer your other question, people can find me on LinkedIn. I'm very easy to find, Bernard at Gouw. And I'm very happy to work with companies of all kind on basically anything related to JEDI, fair work, or human rights.
Awesome. Well, Bernard, thanks again for coming on. We've completed the 3-topic conversation, the trifecta that you're responsible for. And I'll have to get Brigitte on for climate action to wrap up our 7 topics. But really appreciate you. And we'll definitely have you on again as well, just for your sort of latest takes on B Corps, et cetera. So thanks for joining.
Sounds good. Thanks so much for having me.
Hey, Beyond the Bee listeners. If you're looking for even more inspiring conversations with leaders on the front lines of our movement towards just futures, be sure to subscribe to Next Economy Now, produced by the team at Lift Economy. Next Economy Now broadens the focus beyond the B Corp movement to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, democratic, equitable, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy. Check out our latest episodes at lifteconomy.com/podcast. You can subscribe to Next Economy Now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.